People believe that Sam Goldberg did this. They're basically operating on 4 myths. Today on Comm Center, we're going to break down all of those myths in this case, and we're going to get to the truth. The first myth I want to break down is perhaps the biggest myth of all. It's that no investigation took place. The narrative is the police showed up, they talked to Sam briefly, and then that was it. That there was really no investigation into a horrific crime scene, a dead body with several wounds. They just called it a day and left the scene. But Drew, the fact is that homicide detectives were on the scene. They interviewed witnesses in the apartment building. They talked to the concierge, they talked to neighbors, they talked to Sam, who is probably the most crucial witness of all. He would have been considered a suspect initially just arriving on the scene. He's the one that found Ellen's body. He was the significant other. Domestic violence is not something that's misunderstood by the police. They see it every day. And they conducted this investigation, and they had 4 major findings that destroyed Sam as a suspect. First of all, Sam stayed on the scene, and he cooperated fully. He cleared himself by speaking with experienced homicide detectives and police officers who every day in Philadelphia, probably every day, go to scenes where people die by violence that's self-inflicted. Drew, to me, it's just the biggest leap to say that Sam, this regular guy, tricked people who are experts in detecting homicide.
This is very common in what we do, in the stories that we tell, in the experiences that we have, that people who don't have any experience in this somehow can tell us the best way this should be solved or the best way this should be investigated. Even if this were considered a homicide, which it's still not, and my heart goes out emotionally to the family and to her and to anybody else who's suffering. Factually, you can't prove that. And you can't put somebody on trial just because you have a gut feeling about something. Yeah. So even if this were a homicide, you can't say definitively that Sam is the suspect in this thing because he's not. The only thing that people can do is talk about that 48 hours where his family was involved, and it's supposition and gossip. There's nothing definitive that comes from that.
Another big criticism of the investigation that was had is that it wasn't long enough. They don't like the fact that it only took a few minutes for them to analyze the scene and to talk to Sam and witnesses and realize that this was a homicide. But the door was locked from the inside, Drew. How long do you need to investigate that when you see that the door was locked and that it had to be forced open? And the only way that people who don't believe that Sam is innocent in this case say Sam's lying.
So what you're essentially saying is you know better than the people that were there on the scene and investigated this. You quite frankly don't. Like, I understand that there is a ton of documentation. We've run through a ton of documentation.
Right. And if you wanted to believe that, Sam pulled on the door and that's how he broke the latch, which is quite a theory, you don't just get to decide that. You can have an expert come out and say that. But ultimately, a jury's got to weigh both sides. But we can't even get to the point where we can put Sam in front of a jury, and we'll talk about that. But another major finding of that investigation is that there was no signs of an intruder. There's no shoe print in Ellen's blood in the kitchen. No other signs that there was some third-party intruder there. Sam also could have said that something was stolen from the apartment. He could have put out myths into the narrative to suggest that someone else was there, that someone was seen fleeing from the scene. But that building has CCTV. We know that no one was coming and going. We know that nobody else was in that apartment. They didn't leave any physical evidence behind, and he didn't even bother to set up a third-party culprit. There's no reason to believe that someone else could have done this.
Has everyone reviewed the CCTV footage that shows him literally walking down the hallway, opening the gym door, time elapsing, him not exiting, going to the elevator with a big sweat mark down his back, so everything lines up that he was on the treadmill, coming back down, talking to the concierge.
He was inside for an hour.
It was reported in the medical examiner's report that the concierge witnessed him push the door open, which is not the case. But it doesn't mean that that's not dispositive. It was a miscommunication between the medical examiner and the police, perhaps. But at some point, the miscommunication occurred. That doesn't make it suspicious. It makes it a miscommunication. And yes, it does definitely weigh into whether he calls this a homicide or a self-inflicted situation, but he also has to weigh in other factors such as, I can't just call this a homicide and roll the dice and hope that, they charge somebody with this, because now I'm on the hook of having to say definitively that this was a homicide on my word and my investigation after talking to these investigators who were there and the district attorney. I can't put myself out there like that.
The last and biggest major finding of the investigation, and this is where the biggest conflict comes from, is that Ellen had no defensive wounds. They want to argue about the number of wounds, but they don't talk about how most of these wounds were shallow wounds, that they were hesitation wounds. And that kind of wound, a hesitation wound, is extremely common when death is self-inflicted. That's something that the medical examiner said that they see all the time. Did they normally see stab wounds to the back of the neck? No, they don't normally see that. Do they normally see 20 wounds? No. But if you look at the cluster of the wounds around the abdomen, on the chest, and along the neck, all of these wounds are completely within Ellen's range of motion, where she can reach on her own body, and she doesn't have any defensive wounds. Anybody who has investigated homicides before, especially by knife, knows that they are really crazy. They're frenzied. There's marks that are going to be in your hands, they're going to be in your arms, and if you're turning away from your attacker, those marks are going to be not just clustered in one spot high up on your back, they're going to be all over the place, especially if you're trying to get away. But there's no evidence that Ellen was moving around the apartment, that she had torn all over the place trying to get away. Also, they're in an apartment complex, Drew. Nobody heard a loud, frenzied attack going on. This is the daytime hours. There would have been people in the hallway. There would have been people in apartments nearby. Nobody heard this frenzied attack that surely would have woken up the neighborhood, that there's no defensive wounds. And I think that that's actually what's really, really definitive, is that Ellen was not trying to defend herself at any point. There's no marks that show that. All of the wounds, all the evidence, all tell a story. They tell a story that's insane, that a woman might do this to herself, but they don't tell a story that Ellen was trying to get away from or protect herself from any third party. And Drew, finally, the people want an investigation to go forward. They don't understand, why didn't they dive deeper? They say, well, they just ruled it as self-inflicted and they just moved on. But Drew, as a matter for police, the why someone would take their own lives really doesn't matter. And there's no reason for a police investigation to continue. I think most people don't understand certain practicalities behind policing. They don't understand that in Philadelphia, unfortunate it is to say, but there's always another body on the way, whether it's because of homicide, whether it's because it's another case of self-harm, but there's always something else going on. You can't budget your time. You can't budget the finances of your office towards investigating cases that are fundamentally closed. And once you reach the conclusion that this death was self-inflicted, there's no reason. People view this investigation very much like it was a TV show. Like there should have been one cop who just refused to accept the narrative and kept digging at it. But Drew, that's just something you see on TV. Once it's been declared, there's no reason for them to continue investigating. Isn't that right?
That's correct. Let's get back to what Dr. Sam Gulino, the chief medical examiner, actually said. He said, you don't understand. The police said there was no one else with her in the apartment, and I had to do something. So that was the reason for the original ruling of homicide. This was what kind of sparked the debate. He called it one thing, had a slow down, let's talk about this meeting, and changed it to something else. And everyone decided that his talk about it, slow down meeting could not be possible, when in actuality it was three sets of people. It was detectives, district attorneys, and a medical examiner, the pathologist, that all met together that made this decision to change the ruling. No presence of defensive wounds to me is a very big indicator that this was not a struggle of any sort. What also amplifies that is the presence of hesitation wounds. And hesitation wounds are very common in people who are harming themselves.
I think that we need to go back to that meeting that was held between the police, the district attorney, and the medical examiner, because the second big myth of the Ellen Greenberg case is that there was some sort of cover-up, that they viewed it as very unusual. Now, I think the most unusual thing is that you have the police and the medical examiner's office disagreeing as to the manner of death. I think that's very unusual, and that they they were open about it in the press, and they kind of went back and forth, and the journalists were able to make hay out of that. They were able to, and the true crime podcast community was able to get a lot of clicks out of that and a lot of commercials out of that. But as far as following the money in these state offices and in these cities' offices, that goes nowhere. If you want to figure out who stands to gain from protecting Sam from prosecution, who is that person? Who has profited today other than Sam, who has no political power of any kind? The state actually stands to lose if they fail to prove guilt.
Right.
That's double jeopardy. If they go forward now and they miss the mark, they don't get that conviction from the jury, they can never go forward again. And if another piece of evidence comes forward, whether it's witness testimony or some lost piece of physical evidence or something, they can't go forward from there. So there's nothing to gain in protecting him, and they only stand to lose by going forward before they're ready. Now, the true crime audience feels so strongly that Sam did this. We've gone back and forth in the chats. We've seen people talking multiple times, making some of the same points over and over again. You feel so strongly that Sam is guilty. But do you realize that there's an attorney out there, there's many attorneys out there, and their sole job is to convince people of a defendant's guilt? That's what the prosecutor is there to do. They know everything that you do. They know everything that's in the public domain, and they have things in their files that have not been released to the public domain. So the prosecutor's office knows everything that everyone who believes Sam is guilty, they know all of that. And they know more. As certain as you are that Sam is guilty, the prosecutor doesn't believe that he can convince a jury of the same thing. You can watch the Hulu documentary, you can watch stuff on YouTube about it, and you can listen to podcasts, and you can, in your mind, build up this overwhelming and certain evidence. But the prosecutor doesn't agree with you. He doesn't think that he can go out there and do this. Prosecution makes prosecutors more successful. This is a high-profile case. A prosecutor could take this out, and they could really raise their prestige in the legal world, in the political world, by going after Sam and successfully prosecuting him. So why are there no takers, right? There's this prize out there that's to be won by any attorney that wants to go ahead and prosecute Sam, but they're not going after him.
We're not here to tell you what to think. Social media already has enough people telling you to do that. We're here to cut through that noise and hand you something better. Actual signal interpreted by people who spent their careers learning how to read it. And what you do with that is up to you. Because we take the emotion out of these cases and apply facts to them because that's what they deserve. When we're looking at this case, it's not done with emotion. It's done with fact. And the OAG narrative was that the laptop forensic search history it showed that there were actual queries for painless death and methods of removing oneself. And I do understand where people are like, well, Sam's the one that found her. Sam must be the one.
They don't accept it because believing the story, believing the sensationalism is what makes the story interesting. To accept the facts, when you ask uneasy questions and you get unsatisfying answers, you have to walk away and you have to accept the fact that maybe you don't know everything. And sometimes police officers have to do this. Yeah. But the community that is really just after dopamine and not after anything else, they're not willing to let it go. They'll fight tooth and nail. And they just like being part of arguments, Drew. You mentioned a lot about Ellen's anxiety issues. You talked about your own problems in the past. I wanted to mention that on this episode, we're going to do something that we've never done before. For the first time in the history of the Comm Center, we're activating YouTube's fundraising feature to support an organization whose mission we believe in. We're raising money for Hope for the Day, a nonprofit dedicated to proactive prevention of self-harm and mental health education. The goal is simple. They want to break the stigma surrounding mental health problems and encourage honest conversations when a crisis occurs. Outreach programs, education, and community engagement. Hope for the Day helps people recognize that it's okay to ask for help when you're suffering and that no one has to face their struggles alone. If you want to support their mission, please consider making a donation through the fundraiser linked with this video. Every contribution, no matter the size, can go to help people who need those resources, who need that education, and for those who need hope when they need it most. And don't forget that if you're in crisis as well, you can call 988. You can get long-term solutions to the problems that you have. And if you're in a situation that's a crisis, that's imminent, that's happening right now, that's what 911 is here for. We would be remiss if we didn't mention that in this video. But Drew, I wanted to break down the third big myth of this Ellen Greenberg case, and it's the most uncomfortable myth. So before I break this down and bring all this hate upon myself, I want to tell you that I have nothing but sympathy for Ellen Greenberg's family. They lost somebody. They're hurting. They're always going to be hurting. There's never going to be a satisfying conclusion that brings Ellen back. That's Ellen's lost to them forever. A beautiful young woman with all kinds of hope and potential for the future. She had all of these things. She's gone, and they're never going to get that back. Okay, and I'm not here to detract from their suffering, and I'm not here to say they are bad people. Police officers, believe it or not, despite the narrative of the last 6 years, we're on the side of victims. We wake up and we do what we do because we want to see the right thing done. We believe in truth. We believe in justice. And we go out there to get justice, not for something as abstract as the system or the people, but we do it for the victims. But Ellen's family doesn't believe the result of the police investigation that did happen. There was an investigation, and they don't believe it because the outcome of that investigation does not correspond to the beliefs that they hold in their hearts. But only evidence that corresponds with those beliefs are going to restore their faith in the police. If you were further exonerated, the Greenbergs would maintain their position. They would still be holding out hope. They would be driven by hope. They would be driven by the fact that the answers to their questions don't fulfill them, that they don't put them at peace, and they would still be pushing forward for another answer. They certainly want their view of justice for their daughter, what they believe to be justice. But the truth is that cynically, they do stand to gain financially. That's the case. It's this way in every case, not just this case specifically. But if you convicted Sam, that would pave the way for a wrongful death suit. You would be able to sue him in court and potentially legal action against the city as well. So if we're going to be unbiased and we're going to bring you a strong signal of evidence-based stuff from people who know the profession and we know the legal world, we know that in every criminal case where there's a death, there's the potential for a wrongful death suit. And we have to be unbiased enough to say that although we feel for this family, we feel for the Greenbergs, money is, or at least could be, part of their motivation. I know that that's a hard thing to say, but it is true. And Drew, the last and final myth that we've got to break apart is the biggest myth for this channel. We're going to lay it out on the line. Does our expertise matter? Does my expertise matter? Does Drew's expertise matter? Do experts matter? I guess is a question for the age, but a lot of people say that this 911 call sounds fake. All I can say is that the reason you watch the show, I hope, is that you want to hear the take from someone whose bread and butter is 40 hours a week answering 911 phone calls. I do it all the time. I answered 911 calls yesterday. I'll be answering them today. A lot of people who say this call sounds fake have never taken a call, and the experience of reviewing a phone call as someone who's not a 911 dispatcher, even if you're a police officer or prosecutor, it's not the same as being a dispatcher. It's not the same as processing a call live in real time. There's no substitute for that. No one else can say, except a 911 dispatcher, and it doesn't have to be me, what it's like to take a call and whether or not when you're taking that call, you have feelings of suspicion. When you go back and you review this call through the lens of every other piece of evidence that's gathered afterwards that has convinced you that Sam is guilty, all of those things color your judgment when it comes to listening to this 911 phone call. Because if you're thinking about the timeline when you're listening to Sam, if you're thinking about everything that the family has to say about how they feel about it, it doesn't pass a gut check. I understand that, but that's opinion at best. And so if we're just going to have opinions, are we going to go with informed opinions? Or are we going to go with colored opinions? To be fair about this, though, if you're going to go about this in an unbiased way, you can't say that this 911 call sounds suspicious. That reasoning is illogical. You have to first establish what a fake 911 call sounds like. So what are the markers of a fake 911 call? Well, we don't have a lot of laboratory science and hard evidence to say what that is, but we do have a pantheon of 911 calls made by people who were convicted of murder who also employed fake 911 calls. We had people that did that. Darlie Routier, Grant Amato, Susan Smith. Okay, all of these people did that. These calls were histrionic. They were over the top. They were extremely emotional. They pressed forward a certain narrative, especially in the Routier case, about what specifically happened. Susan Smith claimed that a carjacker was there and no one was ever there. Okay. They were over the top emotional. Here's the thing. Goldberg was not overly emotional. He was upset, but he was focused. At one point, the dispatcher says, you have to calm yourself down if you're going to get help. So he's getting emotion, but he locks in. And although he's hesitant to do CPR, he prepares to do it. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that either Sam is being genuine on this 911 phone call, or if he's not being genuine, it means that you can't determine anything from how a 911 call sounds. Because if he did it, and he sounds genuine and he sounds motivated to get involved in Ellen's situation. And this is a legitimate 911 call. And those others are over the top. It just means that no determination can be made. It means some people can fake a 911 call convincingly and other people can't. And as I said, the gut check as to whether or not this sounds fake or it sounds real, even coming from me, it's opinion at best. This is not evidence. You can't go forward in front of a jury and say, this sounds suspicious. You might be able to tug on their emotions. You might be able to convince them, but it's not the same thing as circumstantial or physical evidence.
Unless there's an explicit slip of the tongue, there's no way to determine, just like you say, there's no way to know that. People act so different in emergencies, let alone, when they're on the phone with 911. And I'll tell you from the investigative side, and from being in a 911 chair, there are times when you get the hackles of the on the back of your neck that stand up that tell you, like, there's something not right about this. There's just something not right about this. Sam not only called 911, he acted like a 911 caller. He stuck around when the detectives got there. He didn't hide from anything.
No, he was in the hallway. He was seen by other people crying, being very upset, being willing to engage with police. There was no signs of deception, no signs of subterfuge. He wasn't not cooperating. Drew, you and I have gone to battle over this before, but I talk about how if you're suspected of a crime or you're involved in that the wise thing to do is to say nothing, to get an attorney, to say as little as possible, to not go on the record. And as a police officer, you kind of say, well, if you have nothing to hide, then, why are you hiding? Why are you waiting for an attorney if you don't have an interest to protect? Sam did nothing to protect his own interests. He called 911. Detectives and police officers got there and they interviewed him. And they looked at the scene, and they looked at the latch, and they looked at the floor, and they looked for signs of an intruder. And they talked to witnesses. They canvassed the area. They pulled the CCTV footage. They reviewed the timeline. I know that there were things in this investigation that people feel uneasy about. It kind of goes back to what you mentioned with the Karen Reed case. That crime scene investigation wasn't pristine. It wasn't like what you see on TV. Real life is an exercise of exceptions. Real life is not perfect. Any investigation is going to have things that you can come back on later and say, well, that could have gone better, or that could have gone differently, or that should have gone differently. But that's not what happened in this case, Drew. Right. And Sam did everything that he could to lay aside his own interests, which would have been best served by remaining silent when the police got on scene. And he interacted with police. He talked to police. He told the story to police. And these police officers, again, the true crime community thinks that they know better than Philadelphia homicide, which is not an underworked department. It's not exactly like small town homicide that gets one of these per year. They know what they're doing, and they see cases of self-harm all the time. The most insane leap that the people who believe that Sam Goldberg did this is that a regular guy pulled off the perfect murder and tricked one of the most elite homicide departments in our country.
So there are a couple things to think about. Like, if we're going to look at this objectively, though there's a claim of a lack of defensive wounds, there were bruises that were recovered during the autopsy. So maybe there's some questions about those. Okay. And then there's also, they were missing a smooth bladed weapon from a 2-knife attack. Apparently there were, 2 knives involved. The body being repositioned post-mortem, defying gravity. We talked about the blood pattern in the other one. There's questions over the severed spinal cord, rendering the person unable to move if that spinal injury occurred during the stabbing part. There's also thought that maybe she was strangled and not alive or not conscious when the stabbing was going on. So there are all these questions. If you overcome all of those, or you're able to answer those, that definitively those happened the way they happened, then you have a homicide. But they're not. They haven't been definitively debunked. They haven't been definitively supportive of the homicide ruling. And just a word on the attorneys involved in this, whether district attorney or family advocates or whatever. Very widely popular Hulu documentary about Ellen Greenberg, where the family attorney is a fierce advocate. and he does a wonderful job for that family. But I have to warn all of you of this because I know this to be true. If he were available for hire and he had never met Ellen's family and they accused Sam of this crime and he were Sam's attorney, he would be arguing the exact opposite.
Yeah, he would just as ardently pointing out all the points that conflict with his, because he does great at his job, and there are points to be made on both sides of Sam's guilt, but he's seized on the things that make Sam look guilty, and he's pushed that because that's his job, because that's what he's good at. And if Sam was to go forward with prosecution, you would find a defense attorney who could stand up in court who would make you disbelieve the things that you believe about this case. Because that's what the adversarial process is. That's what the court process is. And right now, the prosecution, who has all these facts, they don't believe that they could overcome that defense attorney. They believe that a defense attorney could go up for Sam and that they could get reasonable doubt and that they wouldn't be able to push forward with this case. True, the case endures because of the curiosity about it. I mean, it's an anomaly for both homicide and for self-harm stories. This is an outlier, no matter how you want to look at it. If you believe that it's a homicide, it's an unusual one. If you believe that it's a case of self-inflicted death, then it's an unusual one. It's definitely an outlier. But part of the true crime culture and the audience and in our society is that you want to look for the perfect closure that comes with a conviction. This case makes everyone feel uneasy. And like I said, the answers that we are provided with feel very unsatisfying. And so we continue to ask questions. We continue to persist in trying to undo the narrative that we're given because it's not a perfect narrative. And we don't feel better about it once we hear what happened. The Greenberg family is leading this narrative that the truth is hidden and justice is not done. They're the ones who are propelling that forward. And sympathy for them is why people gather around that cause and continue to push that forward. But we got to understand that lawyers, filmmakers, YouTube, and Hulu and others profit directly from telling a sensational story.
Right.
And they're going to be as sensational as possible. And you always have to view these things, just like you should this episode, through a critical eye. And you have to also bear in mind the practicality of police limitations and what it means to engage in investigation and what it means to stop investigating. And I'll tell you, there's no true crime story that puts forward the realities of civil rights for a defendant. Okay, Sam has rights. The police have to investigate crime. The police have to enforce the law. The police have to get justice. But part of that justice is making sure that Sam is protected from malicious and undue prosecution. And if they can't make that case, they should not go forward with it. The burden of proof is not something that anyone is ever talking about in this case, and they rarely do talk about it in true crime stories because it's just not very exciting. Saying what the prosecution has to prove and to the degree to which they have to prove it is just not very interesting. It's a procedural thing, and it undoes a lot of the excitement that's in this story. But the need and there's a need for discretion about the facts of this case. The police have to keep some things to themselves. The state's attorney's office has to keep some things to themselves. Some things are sitting in a box somewhere, in a shelf in Philadelphia, because they have to preserve the ability to prosecute this case in the future. Now, what happens with that confidentiality? What happens with that discretion? It creates an atmosphere where there's not very much transparency. And when you're in a situation where the government is not being open and honest with you about everything that they know about Sam, about his activities. They're not being open and honest about what happened in that meeting because that stuff's all confidential. So what does it do? It cultivates this environment in which conspiracy theories run rampant. But as we said earlier, these conspiracy theories don't survive any measure of critical thinking. As I said, who stands to gain? Who stands to gain between some sort of monumental conclusion between the police, the district attorney's office, and the state medical examiner's office? These are three different entities coming together. And how did all three of them profit from this? They needed to resolve a conflict when the medical examiner's office is saying it's a homicide and the police who investigated the prime suspect say that it can't be. Okay, so there's something there for them to resolve, but it needed resolution. It doesn't mean that they came together and that they had a secret meeting in which they decided that they would conspire together to cover up the truth for the benefit of someone besides Sam. I don't know. And what reason would they have to protect him? But mere critical thinking undoes that narrative right away. And cases like this don't really summon critical thinking. a case like this, especially the way it's being presented through these media outlets, they don't want you to think critically. They want you to engage with this story because it's very richly emotional. They want to pull on your heartstrings, not only for Ellen, but for the feelings that you might have about the criminal justice system being incompetent or unfair or biased. And those emotions are what propels interest in this case forward. But if you go forward objectively with critical thinking about what this case is, how it came about, how it was investigated, the conclusions of that investigation, no matter how unsatisfying they are, you realize that rationally and intellectually, this case is closed. And it makes sense that it's closed. Drew?
Yeah, there are no suspects in a self-harm case. So I encourage anyone and everyone to ask a million questions, question authority, do what you got to do. Understand, though, there are answers. And if you're not willing to accept the answers, at some point you got to give up asking questions. So there are no suspects in a self-harm case. And until you can show that this was not a self-harm case, that this is a homicide, you can't call anybody a suspect in anything. So let's get to point A before we've already determined that point Z is a fact. Start asking your questions, but understand critical thinking involves you hearing the answer and processing it and understanding it's not solely based on emotion. A lot of it has to, you in essence need to remove emotion sometimes to get to the saddest conclusion, the most emotional conclusion that you can come to. And that's the personification of this case. That's exactly what this is.
Only blame can assuage the sad feelings that the family has, that people who have empathy for Ellen Greenberg, the only thing that will make them feel better, the only thing that can give them that closure and that conclusion is blame placed somewhere. So if they can't convict Sam, then they have to blame the police. And these feelings of blame are going to continue as long as they refuse to accept the uneasy answers. And they're bad answers. I get that. The idea that a woman could do this to herself, it's not satisfying. It doesn't make you feel good about life. It makes you feel more sad.
Well,
and it makes you feel sad because you wish you had been able to intervene in that. Go ahead.
Understand, too, that there are warnings on some of those medications that specifically address this. That when somebody is going through like this part of their life and they're diagnosed with whatever, depression, anxiety, and they're given certain medications, the warning label says specifically on there that there is a risk of self-harm. And it means that, you know, I'm sure that her parents are thinking, there's no way in her right mind she would do this. Right. She was on medication. She was on mind-altering medication. It's an unfortunate consequence, and it's a possibility. Like, that's all there is to it. Like, that's just as much a possibility as any other culprit in this thing.
Yeah. And we'll be watching, you know, if more evidence comes forward, we'll keep an open mind about that. And for now, I guess I view that this case is closed, that the answers that have come about, even though they're unsatisfying, I have to accept them. Drew, before we go, I just wanted to remind everybody, we are using YouTube's fundraiser feature to support Hope for the Day. It's a nonprofit organization focused on prevention of self-harm and mental health education and ending that stigma around asking for help. If you enjoyed this episode and you want to support a cause that can make a difference in somebody's life, consider making a donation of this fundraiser that we have linked below. Every dollar helps Hope for the Day. It helps them continue their mission of creating conversations, providing resources to people in need, and reminding people that hope is always out there and it's always worth reaching for. So thank you for watching this channel. Thank you for supporting our channel. And we hope that you support this cause that matters to us. And if you want to see more episodes here on Comm Center, stuff that we've covered before, we've talked about this topic a lot. I encourage you to go back and watch these videos. Otherwise, Drew, it's been a great episode, and we will see you guys next week.
911 emergency, police or paramedics.
He's going westbound on foot.